Good afternoon. I'm going to concentrate my talk more on the political economy side of the title of our panel, How Latin America Competes Globally. And I'll start by saying that a number of years ago, back in 2001, I was working as a Brazilian diplomat stationed in our delegation in New York to the UN. And one of my tasks a particular day was to escort a high-ranking congressman who had gone to the U.S. to speak to a number of investment banks about plans for Brazil, whether Lula be elected the following year, 2002, the Lula president. And we were welcomed in one of those big buildings on Park Avenue and 51st Street. And there was all this talk about the intentions of the Lula candidate towards building a macroeconomic environment that was friendly to investors and by making Brazil again an important player in terms of international trade. And this talk was greeted by great skepticism by our host, who was the chief economist of this big bank, very important bank. And he said, well, very likely you will default by 2002, as the rest of Latin America. He was particularly true about what happened in Argentina in 2001, and he was wrong about Brazil, especially because in 2002, the International Monetary Fund put the largest rescue package in history to help Brazil overcome the aftermath of the so-called Asian crisis. But the funny thing is that this chief economist was the chief economist of Bear Stearns, a bank that was simply swept away from the financial marketplace a couple of weeks ago. But why am I telling this story? It's because I think 7 years ago, about Brazil and about Latin America, there was a giant spiral of pessimism. People were very pessimistic about Latin America. And I think there was stern reason to be pessimistic about Latin America. But when we come to the US now and we read stories on international press, visit other countries, particularly in Europe, people are very optimistic about Brazil and very optimistic about Latin America. As a matter of fact, Professor Troyjo, when he opened the conference yesterday, he was saying, well, unlike many previous years, this particular edition of the Latin Conference is reason to celebrate that Latin America is experiencing a good moment. And I think now there is a spiral of optimism about Latin America. And what is right? I mean, should we be, driven to this ever-growing positive feeling about what's going to happen in Latin America, or is there something lying in our way that may hammer our hopes, as one was mentioning here yesterday? And I think in order to answer these questions, we should better try to define what Latin America is today in terms of the global political economy, and specifically what Latin America is not. For example, Latin America is not a trading bloc. When one talks about Europe today, one is talking about a political actor and an economic actor and a trade actor of significant importance. Europe today is no more only what the French call an être de raison, something that only exists in the plan of ideas. Europe exists as an economic and political actor. It has some single interests that are expressed by means of European views. Latin America is not a trading bloc. Latin America is not a multilateral organization in the sense that, for example, the WTO is, or in the sense that the ASEAN is. Of course, we have ALADI and we have ALAUKI and we have other organizations in the region that work more as think tanks to project possibilities for the development of our regions. But these are not political bodies, really, that matter in the international arena. So what is correct to say about Latin America? Latin America is a region that shares a particular past that is common in terms of culture, of language. As a matter of fact, the first time one used the expression Latin America, it was not someone from the colonies of Portugal or Spain. He was a Frenchman, Michel Chevalier. He was a senator in France, and by the mid-19th century, he wanted to oppose what was then seen as an overpresence of the United States in the entire hemisphere by means of the Monroe Doctrine. And he therefore defended that France, because of the cultural ties that it had with the non-Anglo-Saxon countries of the region, should be in Paris with them. And then he said, well, the peoples of Latin America. And of course, there's also another origin to the expression that comes from the Chilean philosopher Bilbao and the Colombian poet Torres y Cedo. But these are all cultural reasons, not really economic reasons. And why is this important? Because for the global economy, regions simply are not important players. The players in the global economy are the nations, the trading blocs. And more important even, and then I think it makes sense again to talk about Latin America, the global economy is about models with which you can face these difficult challenges. And if you don't remember anything that I'll say in this conference, make sure that you remember this. For the past 25 years, there is a model of dealing with the global economy, or perhaps basically two models that are opposing in terms of strategy. And one that has been mostly adopted in Latin American countries, which I call the liability model. And there is another model that is mostly adapted in Asian countries, that is the trading model. What do the liability country models and trading country models have in common? They both start off at very low rates of savings, very difficult access to credit. So whenever there's international liquidity, liability models go about taking advantage of the fact that international interest rates are very low and they indebt themselves. This is basically the story of Brazil, of Argentina, and Turkey in the great majority of the second half of the 20th century. Whereas other countries, as Japan and Germany, right after World War II, and more recently China, especially by the end of the 1970s when it's reached the most favored nation status agreement with the United States, have adopted a trading model. These countries go about dealing with international liquidity, not by indebting themselves, but by selling. They sell. They elect as a priority, as their national strategy, to build an export facility that will guarantee the trade surpluses will be the mattress of resources from which they will be able to construct their endogenous growth.